It is extremely regrettable that members of the Security Council are forced today to waste time attending a meeting initiated by our European colleagues solely for the New York tour of a well-known former actor. For this occasion, they are packed here like a subway at rush hour, and every speech we have heard and will hear is simply a rehash of the previous ones and bears no relation to the truth. Our meeting, of course, will bring no added value to the cause of peace in Ukraine and will be nothing more than another shameful episode in the hypocritical fairground that is the presentation of the Ukrainian issue by European states. The European sponsors of the Zelensky regime want the UN Security Council to live, like them, in some parallel reality in which Ukraine doesn't lose on the battlefield, losing city after city, and Ukrainian citizens line up to die in a senseless slaughter for Western geopolitical interests. In this distorted picture they are trying to impose on us today, Ukraine is an island of democracy and freedom, and its usurper leader, who broke all his campaign promises and imprisoned thousands of his fellow citizens, enjoys the support of all Ukrainians, who see no need for elections since they have such a wonderful president. Those who, for whatever reason, play along with Ukraine's European puppeteers in this must understand that they are essentially becoming accomplices in a criminal manipulation whose goal is to prevent a long-term, just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, which would include, among other things, the development of security guarantees that would eliminate the threat of a new conflict in Europe. This is, in essence, a conspiracy aimed at ensuring that Ukrainians continue to die by the thousands in a senseless fratricidal massacre which Russia's Western enemies have been preparing for many years, hoping to bleed our country dry and undermine its security and economic potential. At the same time, they deliberately ignore ugly phenomena that are blatant for any civilized state and that no self-respecting government would tolerate, either in its own country or in its neighbors. We are all, in particular, being asked to turn a blind eye to the fact that the Kyiv puppets, driven mad by Russophobia and the permissiveness of their overlords, have no intention of abandoning their persecution of Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, forbidding them, contrary to their own constitution, to speak their native language and teach it to their children. Before our very eyes, people are being forced, under threat of death and persecution, to renounce their identity, their spiritual and historical roots. And all the so-called European democracies applaud this, baselessly claiming that Russia allegedly wants to trample Ukrainian identity. We have never had such a goal. This is a huge, brazen lie, promoted by the Kyiv princeling to intimidate and dupe the world community. We are being asked to forget how the non-Nazi regime in Kyiv, emboldened by impunity and brought to power by a Western-sponsored coup d'etat that violated the UN Charter, gunned down defenseless people in southern and eastern Ukraine with tanks and artillery, dropped bombs on them and burned them alive in the Odessa Trade Union House. It humiliated and mocked them simply because they were Russian and refused to accept the Kyiv regime's misanthropic ideology. And then, for 7 years, under the guise of the Minsk agreements, it was armed to the teeth, supplied with intelligence and prepared for war with Russia, as several retired European politicians who were directly involved have admitted. And we are also urged to ignore how Ukraine continues to glorify those who, along with the Nazis, exterminated hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, Roma, and even Ukrainians during World War II. How Kyiv's European partners shamefully lower their eyes when they see swastikas and other Nazi and non-Nazi symbols banned in their own countries on the bodies of the nationalist Ukrainian fighters they train. Mr. Chairman, for those who try to force the entire world to think within this distorted paradigm, history only begins in February 2022. They don't want to remember the broken promises to prevent NATO expansion eastward or the indivisibility of security. They want to erase from memory what they did in Kyiv in 2014. They're ripping from the UN Charter the sole principle of respect for the territorial integrity of states, forgetting about their sovereign equality, non-interference in their internal affairs, and the right of peoples to self-determination. They see the problem only in actions that are a response to their own actions. They're quickly replacing international law with a so-called order based on rules they themselves invent and impose on others. The Ukrainian crisis is a direct result of their actions and steps, taken for many years, despite all our warnings and calls to stop and abandon a course that is leading to disaster for this country. Now, when this disaster is obvious to everyone except the leader of the Kyiv regime, who is saving his own skin and his stolen billions, and those who brought him to power, they are trying to undermine efforts aimed at establishing a long-term and sustainable peace in Ukraine. This country has become a byword not only for its rampant corruption and total lawlessness, but also for the blatant double standards that the collective West and its media outlets demonstrate in the Ukrainian context. Nowhere in the world, in any conflict, have the Kyiv regime so consistently ignored its undeniable violations of international humanitarian law, using civilians as human shields and deploying air defense systems in close proximity to residential areas. This leads to tragedies involving debris falling on residential buildings or missed anti-aircraft missiles, which would otherwise not have occurred, since the Russian aerospace forces, as has been repeatedly emphasized, exclusively conduct precision strikes against targets belonging to the Kiev regime's military-industrial potential. Furthermore, in most cases, these strikes are a response to Ukrainian drone strikes against civilian targets in Russian cities, and the targeted shelling of Ukrainian Nazis in residential buildings, schools, kindergartens, and hospitals, which the West tries to ignore. Unfortunately, the UN Secretariat is playing along, eagerly echoing any claims from Kyiv and ignoring the dismal statistics voiced by the Russian authorities. This constitutes a flagrant violation of Article 100 of the UN Charter, which requires impartiality among UN staff. This line does Antonio Guterres and his subordinates no credit. Mr. Chairman, it's clear to all of us today that the EU and NATO are deeply entangled in the anti-Russian Ukrainian project, confused and lying, and have no idea how to extricate themselves from the situation they've gotten themselves into. Washington was the first to see the light after the new American administration came to power. However, instead of joining efforts aimed at establishing peace, Brussels and its allied capitals, whether through inertia or deliberately, continue to spin the flywheel of war, consistently and without any basis portraying Russia as an enemy that will inevitably attack them should it deal with Ukraine. Today, this war party has lost sleep, trying in every way to undermine the results and understandings reached during the meeting between the Russian and US presidents in Alaska a month ago. They are throwing tantrums, including in this very room, over unsubstantiated claims of Russian drones flying into Poland or Russian fighter jets flying over Estonia. This brainwashing and zombification of the population, the desire to blame Russia for its own shortcomings and mistakes, and the dire economic and social problems facing European societies as a result of their ill ill-conceived sanctions, is comparable only to the indoctrination of German and Italian citizens on the eve of World War II. And then, having learned yet another bitter lesson from history, all these manipulators will shrug their shoulders and claim they didn't understand the consequences of their actions. It's encouraging that not everyone in Europe is prepared to follow this disastrous path. And more political forces and leaders are emerging who reject war and confrontation in Europe and advocate for the development of mutually beneficial and equal relations with Russia. We have advocated for this scenario from the very beginning. Mr. Chairman, the contours of a future world in Ukraine are clear to us all, and it is also obvious that the Kyiv regime's vision of what it might look like bears no relation to reality and merely condemns thousands more Ukrainian citizens unwilling to go to the front to senseless deaths. Just yesterday, on a Ukrainian television channel, a local propagandist lamented that many Ukrainians are being rounded up on the streets, but they are, I quote, quickly running out. This cynical statement sums up the essence of the Kyiv regime. Do you agree with it regarding this unenviable fate for the remaining Ukrainian citizens? If so, we have nothing to discuss. If you care about them, we look forward to your support and sincere work with those who are trying to find the contours of a realistic, long-term and sustainable peace that would stop this war, started by the criminal Kyiv clique in 2014. We do not reject any negotiation formats, but we advocate exclusively for serious, substantive, and open-minded conversations. We do not reject negotiations with Ukraine, despite the extremely dubious, to put it mildly, legitimacy of its current authorities. The optimal format for this has already been identified: the negotiating platform in Istanbul. Everything else can only be discussed once significant expert results have been reached there. Unfortunately, that is still a long way off. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I would like to recall the prophetic words spoken on the sidelines of the General Assembly's high-level week 2 years ago by Polish President Andrzej Duda. I quote, "Ukraine, like a drowning man, is dragging us all down." Today, many of those who spoke in this hall have already become such drowned souls. If you're content with such an inglorious fate, you can do nothing and continue in the same spirit. If not, there's much work to be done. We were and are ready for it. Now it's your turn to make that choice.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished leaders, representatives of states and governments, and all those who still pay attention to the work of the United Nations. We must admit the world's attention to the UN is fading. The organization has less influence, and too often there is a lack of real decisions on fundamental issues. This is exactly what we need to speak about today, about the tools that sadly are not working now. But they will work, I'm sure. They will work if you are active, if we are active, because the main tool is in your hands. First of all, I thank the Republic of Korea for this meeting of the Security Council and for the opportunity to call for peace. Today, there will be a clear call for peace in this Council. And here is one of the main distortions of our time. Whom must we call to peace, and on whom must we press to achieve it? One of the prominent members of this Council is doing everything to prolong the largest war in Europe since World War II. Russia does this with impunity, using its veto power, buying influence, and keeping peace on hold. The Russian representative is here, but of course not the one who makes the real decisions. That man fears to sit face to face with Ukraine and the world and openly admit he wants only war. Instead, Putin sends delegates who cannot and don't want to stop the bloodshed. And when he appears abroad, in Beijing or somewhere else, it's only to buy more time for killing, pretending he seeks diplomacy. Putin only cares about using every meeting, every chance to keep the war going. Each day, Russia kills our people, destroys our cities, and leaves no sign it will ever return to the principles of the UN Charter. China is also represented here, a powerful nation on which Russia now depends completely. If China truly wanted this war to stop, it could compel Moscow to end the invasion. Without China, Putin's Russia is nothing. Yet too often, China stays silent and distant instead of active for peace. The United States of America is present here as well, a strong nation that supports our defense, and we've said yes to every proposal from the US president for a ceasefire and talks with Russia to bring peace, but Russia always says no or tries to confuse everyone so that even a ceasefire can't happen. And I met with President Trump just now, and we spoke about how to finally bring peace, and we discussed a few good ideas, and I hope they will work. And I'm grateful for this meeting, and we expect America's actions to push Russia toward peace. Moscow fears America and always pays attention to it. The United Kingdom is here, a permanent member of the Security Council. France is here, also a permanent member. Both nations support us, support our people, our independence. Both promote diplomacy, and both are parties to a document that was supposed to be a positive milestone, together with the other permanent members of the UN Security Council, but instead it became a warning to the world. The Budapest Memorandum, meant to guarantee Ukraine's security in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, failed. It proved that international promises can turn into blabbering. That is why today, with Britain, with France, and already with more than 30 nations in our coalition of willings, we are building a new security architecture. We count on the United States of America as a backstop. Real security guarantees must become the line Russia cannot cross again. Here is one example of how strength can stop war. If we could strengthen our skies with a joint system to shut down with a joint system to shut down Russian missiles and drones, it would force Russia to stop its attack from the sky, because everything could be shut down, and so Putin would be forced to sit here or in another respectable venue and look for a truce on the ground. If there is no war in the sky, Russia can't keep fighting on the ground. I have talked about this with President Trump and with other leaders. Why do I say this now and here? Because you, the United States, China, Britain, France, the permanent members of the Security Council, represent the world's essential power, the power that must act when international law alone cannot. And no, not Russia. With this war, Russia has discredited itself, even for those who do not yet criticize Putin openly. They still feel that Russia's presence brings no good. Excellencies, behind every international institution, there must be real strength to enforce decisions. This is true for the Security Council and for the UN as a whole. If you stand together for ending this war, even Russia will have to obey. And if some of you act while others delay, the war goes on. Ukraine wants peace more than anyone in the world. The front is on our land, and we mourn our people, and we try to save our cities and to save our small villages. Russia ignores its dead, blind to its own losses. But one day it will see and it will hear, and it will happen when it sees your actions, when it hears your united call for peace. That is my appeal to you today. Be the force that act together, please, united lest to stop Russia's war. And we know how to guarantee security. What we need now is a strong push to force Russia toward peace. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.